Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting the webinar in just a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience. Hello again, everyone. Now that it's 1:01, I'm going to get started with the presentation. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Vivian Garcia. I'm the Marketing Manager for English at Bedford St. Martin's. We wanted to thank you for joining us today. And today marks the last webinar for our weekly webinar series that we did this week. And this is part of Bedford's Professional Development Webinar Series. Today's speaker will be Richard Miller from Rutgers University, one of our authors, and he'll be talking on losing privacy and embracing creativity. So before we get to Richard, I just wanted to do a little housekeeping first regarding who we are and things to know about the webinar. So what we stand for is that Bedford puts writers first. So how do we put writers first? Community support. This webinar series is a perfect example of that type of support, but we offer professional resources in the form of different books that we offer to the English writing community. We also have an English community site, not to mention various sponsorships of conferences and different events that we host. We also pride ourselves on providing content you know and trust. We work with authors that have incredible experience in teaching writing. We have a phenomenal editorial team, many of whom have taught themselves, and all of this works together to create content that you know and trust. Then curriculum solutions, we mention this as a way, if you want to cater materials to how you teach the course, we offer different customization options for all types of courses, and that's something that Bedford is very proud of. And then finally, last but not least, our customer service on the ground. Many of you are most likely familiar with your Bedford St. Martin's rep, and whether you're seeing them in person, over the phone, or contacting us online, we strive to offer consultation for any professors looking for materials for their course to help you find exactly what you need. Now, with that said, I wanted to give you a little overview of things to keep in mind during the webinar. You'll notice it's awfully quiet. That's because the participants are muted. However, we do want to hear from you. So as the presentation is going on, feel free to enter chat and questions in the chat and question boxes. You'll see that on the right-hand side on the control dashboard for the webinar. We will be getting to those questions at the end of the presentation. If you are having any trouble hearing me clearly, we encourage you to dial in via phone if you're having that type of issue. We are going to have a poll at the end after the presentation about writing challenges. So we encourage you again to refer to the dashboard to vote using the polling feature because we'd love to hear from you. And finally, wanted to let you know that we will be making both the slides for the presentation as well as a recording available after the webinar. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our author, Richard Miller. He's a professor of English at Rutgers University, and he has over 30 years experience teaching writing. He's trained undergraduates to be writing tutors and graduate students to teach first-year writing. He's participated in the administration of writing programs. He's run immersive writing seminars for experienced teachers. He's an award-winning teacher, an avid blogger, and a poet. Richard has an abiding interest in both apocalyptic literature and apocalyptic thinking. So having just completed On the End of Privacy, Learning to Read, Write, and Think in a Screen-Centric World, and that's from the University of Pittsburgh Press, Richard is taking a deep breath before deciding what to work on next. So without further ado, I am going to turn over control of the presentation to Richard so that he can show you his wonderful presentation. Okay, Richard, are you ready?
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay, great.
There we go.
Perfect.
Got it?
Yes, I'm seeing your screen.
Okay, super. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is my first webinar, so if you want to voice something during the presentation, as Vivian said, please just type in the chat or question area and I'll be able to see it. So if you're having trouble hearing or you'd like me to go over something again, I'm happy to do so. I'm going to talk today about the relationship between my research and my teaching in this presentation on losing privacy and embracing creativity. So I begin with some writing advice I got in graduate school from one of my first teachers of writing at UMass Boston, from Anne Berthoff. And in classic Anne fashion, it's an aphorism of a sort and kind of a mystery. But she said, don't write one book, write two. Now, Anne was a very prolific writer. She's even working on writing at this point in her 90s. But she brought a perspective to the teaching of writing that is still virtually unique in her emphasis on the importance of the imagination and paying attention to the mind's ability to create forms and create a sense of form. So with her emphasis on dialectical thinking, she always had us in that class thinking about what's the relationship between theory and practice, and then what's the relationship between practice and theory. So in 2010, I had decided to take a break from academic writing. I'd finished being chair of the department and I'd done a lot of bureaucratic and administrative work. And I just really needed to refresh and recharge my interest in the teaching of writing. So I decided I was only going to write online. I wanted to learn how to do it. And as it so happens, the semester that I decided to do that, barely 3 weeks into the semester, 2 students at Rutgers made local, then national, and then international news. There were 2 roommates, Darun Rabi and Tyler Clemente, and the story captured people's attention because, as we found out later, Darun sent out a tweet from his computer in his dorm room, and he's saying, roommate asked for the room till midnight. I went into Molly's room and turned on my webcam. I saw him making out with a dude. Yay. So then just 3 days later, Tyler updated his Facebook status to read, jumping off the GW Bridge, sorry. And that was the last act that Tyler did. So this was tragic and traumatic at the university level. It was very shocking, but it was also just this extraordinary exposure to the power of this digital technology, that a few sentences could be exchanged in the digital sphere, and in a very short amount of time, tragedy could be triggered by that. So that had me thinking about how the power of writing has changed from when I was trained to be a writing teacher and we were working with paper, and looking at how writing has power in this new digital format. And so I found myself working on this problem of what does it mean to be teaching now, that anything that can be seen or heard or written can be published and globally distributed in an instant, um, like a tweet or like a Facebook update. Um, and for teachers, this really has some very serious and profound implications. It means that writing's no longer a private affair. It's not the writer off in the grotto with the writer's own thoughts. The writer's at a computer, and the computer's recording what's being taken down. And once that's on a hardware drive, it could be published instantly with or without the author's permission. Teaching's no longer private because just as a student can use a webcam to spy on another student, students now can use their cell phones. There's extraordinary surveillance devices being sold now. I had a student show me a pair of glasses. They look like sort of Clark Kent glasses, but they have a digital camera over the nose piece, and they can record for 2 hours of HD video and sound. And if you're lecturing, you think you're just looking at a student with some kind of funky hipster glasses on, and they could be taping you. So those two things are very significant. The writing students do, the writing any of us do, isn't. As soon as it's on a hard drive, it's subject to being released. Teaching, this happens all the time. Teachers now are filmed saying things, behaving in ways that are inappropriate, or how they're behaving is taken out of context, and that's posted online. And then finally, the essence of learning itself, making mistakes, making missteps, are no longer forgotten. Once the information is on the web, getting it off the web is, I would say, for all intents and purposes, impossible, but we can say virtually impossible. So I didn't set out to do this on purpose, but I set out to try and figure out how to write online. But as a result of this local tragedy and the way in which that tragedy was fundamentally connected to digital technology, I've spent about 7 years writing online about instances with writing being central to some event and the writing being in the digital world. And I just couldn't get it to come together. I would try to find the structure, find a way to put my thoughts about all of this together, and I just couldn't figure it out. I kept getting stuck. I started over 4 times, and eventually it was Anne's advice, a version of Anne Berthoff's advice, that got me out of this mess. And so I would explain it this way now. I didn't know it while I was in it, but I would explain it this way now. That as I was working on the question of what happens to writing once the very possibility of privacy is removed, is that I was identifying a problem, I was determining the causes of that problem, and I was providing a theory about both where that problem came from and what its implications were. And eventually I came to see that I was just doing one side of the dialectic, when I would identify the problem, writing in the digital age, um, I had thousands of questions would surface immediately about, is that the right way to formulate the problem? Is that really the central problem? Isn't there some other question that would be a better one to ask, a better one to explore? I'd be determining causes, and then as soon as I was determining, I'd say, well, it could be that, but it could be 100 other things. Um, and I was providing a theory, but as a teacher, I want to know, well, how do I respond to this in the classroom? So I do one side of the dialectic, but I would want to be working on the other side. And the way this problem got solved was that I didn't, again, I didn't know this while I was doing it, but my colleague and I, Andrew Essex, started working. We talked together a couple of times, and we just were starting to try and think about how on earth do you teach now that there's all this digital technology in the room. The days of when you had to pay a whole bunch of money and it was very involved to create networked classrooms has been replaced by students bringing in their own smartphones or their own laptops. And how do we teach in this new highly mediated digital space? Um, so I kept writing about various case studies of writing in the digital age online, but I really settled down with Anne and got to work on this book that we called Habits of the Creative Mind. And it asked a different question, a related question, but a different one. How do you write effectively in the digital age? Um, and that was a question I didn't know the answer to. I had wanted to, my original desire to go online was to, and learn how to write was, I wanted to figure out how do you write powerfully online. So the book, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, really explores what the difference, the central difference between teaching writing now that writing happens on screens rather than on paper. And to introduce that to you and connect it to the privacy issue, how can we prepare students to write in a world without privacy? In the On the End of Privacy book, this is a problem, but in the Habits book, this is a problem that we can't simply identify. We need students to work with it and think seriously about it. So we have a section in the book that that has the students think about where they do their writing. In the physical space, where do they do it? And then in the digital space, where do they do it? And we have a number of exercises then, after we have them thinking about both the physical and the digital spaces, to think about the digital legacy that's left behind by all of the work that students do on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat. The digital footprint is immense, and there's no erasing it. So what we offer is a number of exercises in this section for students to think about how can you curate a site, a digital space online that represents you the way you want to be represented. And that's an act of writing, but it's also an act of self-representation. So you can see that from the slide that's up there that our practice sessions emphasize which of the habits we want the students to be exercising or exploring in that particular practice session, and then what the activities themselves are going to entail. So that's an important exercise. What does your browser history reveal about you? And we want students to think about that. So that's one way of thinking about the transition. The book was looking at the problem of the end of privacy, and the Habits book is thinking about how do we write. This is the new condition. We can't eliminate it. We can't change it. And clearly, writing still has an incredible amount of power. But the way that that power is expressed and manifests in the digital age, in the screen-based age, is, I argue, on the end of privacy, it's fundamentally different. And in habits, we insist upon it seeing that it's fundamentally different as well, but we offer exercises to show students how to work with that reality. So I'm going to give you one exercise, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you think about the difference between writing in the age of privacy, I mean, in the age of paper, information was scarce. Students had to go to the library. We all had to go to the library to find the books and information we needed. But now it's not only that information's available 24/7, there's too much of it. There's too much of everything. So the writing environment is radically different in the digital age. In the age of paper, research took place in the library. In the digital age, research takes place anywhere, anytime, and it's not just print. It's film, it's sound, it's images. So it's multimodal, it's collaborative, it's also interactive. These are not, so it's not the digital world is, I argue, it's not that the digital world is a version of the paper world. It's a different ballgame. And we wrote habits so that we could teach students how to work in this new writing environment. So I'm going to look at what I mean, for some teachers, this is one of the central concerns. How do you get students to document their research? And certainly when I was a student learning how to write, before the idea of a personal computer was even in the minds of the average person, the focus was MLA style and how do you get that footnote to end on the bottom of the page you're typing. But the function of the need for a footnote now is different. What kind of footnote is needed in the digital sphere is different from what the footnote served in the paper sphere. So when information was scarce, the footnotes told us, well, this is where you go in the library, and this is the page it's on, and this is what section you might find the book in with its Dewey Decimal System, which is not in the footnote, obviously, but if you went to the library, that would be part of finding the actual location of the source. Much of that work isn't necessary at this point, or it's certainly not work that students are in the habit of pursuing. And so one of the exercises we have for the students to do now is to work on interpretive footnotes, where they pay attention to where their source comes from. And we all know how important that is. How do you assess whether your source is reliable or not? In the old days, you'd go to the library, and if it had the right press on it, then it was a reliable source. That doesn't work in the digital age. And so we want to train students how to look at it for the source of the information they're dealing with. And then what's the spin? What's the take? What's the angle that's that source is expressing, or how it's been cited? So we discussed this idea at length in one of our essays in the book called On Reading in Slow Motion. And this is an exercise where we have students read a piece slowly. So we don't say read an essay for Monday. We might say read the first 2 pages of the essay. And then the next class, we might say now read the next 2 pages. And we go through the piece very slowly. And then we pay a lot of attention to what citations, what words, what passages, concepts appear in that essay. And then we have the students compose interpretive footnotes. How is this author using the word liberty, for example? How is this author referring to the Constitution when they use the word liberty, or are they referring to a different legacy or history for that word? That's the kind of attention we want to have our students learn how to pay to their sources. So I'm doing this in a class right at this moment. I'm teaching Rebecca Solnit's The Faraway Nearby, and we're in this class, we're reading the entire book slowly, with 15 pages a class. And at this point in the semester, having students engage with her sources, and the first major writing exercise is to produce this interpretive footnote. And so one thing I require in my classes is that all the writing my students do has to be online, and I want it to move in a multimodal direction. And whenever I assign an interpretive footnote, I do one first to show the students how I would do it with the book we're working with. And in this case, very early on in The Faraway Nearby, Solnit mentions Narcissus, and this is the quote there at the bottom. The fact usually proffered about Narcissus is that he was in love with his own image in the mountain pool. But the more important one is that in his absorption, in his reflection, he lost contact with others and starved to death. So we have this quote, and then the exercise is to find a source that also uses Narcissus, or whatever the myth or reference you're using from Solnit, and explore that use of the term, and that'll help us to understand what Solnit is doing with the myth. So I chose Dolly's famous representation of Narcissus, and I went out and did some research on it, and I found out, so I didn't know this, but Dolly wrote a poem that was supposed to go along with this painting that you were supposed to read, and the poem has this reference to Gala at the end, who it turns out is Dolly's wife, and that Dolly's representation of Narcissus has very little to do with the myth that Solnit's using. He's certainly not emphasizing that Narcissus starves to death. For him, Narcissus' transformation into a flower is an extraordinary success. And so putting those two uses next to each other, we get a better understanding of Solnit's use of the myth, Dolly's use of the myth, and the myth itself. And that's really the project of the interpretive footnote. So I'm going to show you just one example from class right now that a student's put. It's obviously very rough, but Solnit writes a great deal about Cupid and Psyche. And the student goes out, my instructions are you need to find an interpretive image of the myth. She's found one. She's found a quote that of one source for telling the story of Cupid and Psyche. And I popped into her site on the website I've created for the class, and she's working away, and she's got this writing coming together that just shows the kind of work I'm trying to get students to produce in my classes. I want them entertaining possibilities. I want them making connections between original sources. And I want them engaging in the act of wondering. And she's doing all of that in this writing. She's wondering how Solnit has interpreted Cupid and Psyche's myth now that she's gone out and looked up the way the story was told in one of the original sources. And she gets to the point of where she's saying, what I'm noticing in the actual story is that Psyche is fated to be with Cupid. Not much of what she does is on her own accord. Thrice on her journey to see him again, she tries to kill herself, but with divine intervention is brought back. the story isn't necessarily that love triumphs all, but that divine intervention does. And this is exactly the kind of work I'm hoping students will do, that they'll see that in citing works, we interpret them. That's inescapable. And then the work is, well, what's going on with the interpretation? And in this case, I was particularly interested in her phrasing. We have another essay in the book that says that's on the 3 most important words in the English language, and it's on connecting. And we have, as this says, it's a rubric that oversimplifies to the point of distortion. But that said, most students start off connecting everything with the word and we're interested in getting students to begin to use the word but or. And that's exactly what she's doing here, to look at Cupid and Psyche, isn't that wonderful? And she's, well, if you look at it really closely, no, she tries to kill herself 3 times. And the only reason she's saved is not because of love, it's divine intervention. So the myth has been transformed over time. So that's an example of what kind of writing is happening in class. I just want to close with an example of how working on this book managed to solve the writing problem I'd written myself into with On the End of Privacy. Anne was working on, in the section on organizing, we have 3 essays on organizing, and we're both big fans of Rebecca Skloot, who wrote The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And Anne was out there online doing research, and she goes, "You're not going to believe it. I just found a picture of how Skloot figured out how she was going to organize Henrietta Lacks, because she spent 10 years trying to figure out how to tell the multiple threads of that story. And she's got these note cards, and it's a timeline, and it's related to how films work. And that discovery then made it possible for me to figure out what I wanted to be doing in On the End of Privacy. And if you look at the table of contents next to each other for the 2 books, the connection will be obvious. Habits is committed to having students learn how to write essayistically. And what I was able to figure out that I needed to be doing in On the End of Privacy was I needed to organize it as a series of interconnected meditations. So the story, the overarching story of Tyler Clementi, his suicide, Darun Ravi's trial, his appeal, his case going to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, New Jersey Supreme Court, the New Jersey Supreme Court ruling on what constitutes a hate crime. All of those, that all came together as a result of working on the issue of, well, how were we going to organize habits? And we came up with the habits that we were identifying that we wanted students to practice. And then we came up with this model for writing these short essays that are meant to be read. They're not filler in a handbook about how to handle the semicolon. These are really idea-driven essays that are meant to spark the imaginations for the students. So writing one book actually helped me finish both of these books together. Having a collaborators also was essential to the process. But in the process, it's not that one book's theory and the other book's practice. It's that actually both books are working on questions of theory and practice and how they connect with each other. So you need those things, and you need a great editorial team, which is what I have at Macmillan. And so we're very happy with the 2nd edition and the support we've gotten. And we're looking forward to getting more feedback from people who are using it out in the world. So I'll stop there, and I'd love to talk further with you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I'm going to monitor the chat and the questions to see, give everyone time to type in any that you have after the presentation has taken place. Okay, I see one now. Let's see. Do you cover research strategies with your students before asking them to do, sorry, it's cutting off from me. I'm trying to see how I can make this larger. Forgive me, everyone. I'm new to, I forgot half the question, but to go to webinar, and I'm trying to figure out how we can make this larger. It's like a cliffhanger. And I had been warned about this by one of my colleagues that could be a little difficult to read. I'm just trying to, it's not allowing me to scroll down to see the rest of the question. Are you able to see it by any chance? Oh, I think I see it now. Do you cover research strategies with your students before asking them to do research? Many students today don't necessarily view privacy as important in the same way.
So those are actually, I would say those are two separate questions. I really talk about research from the very first day we meet, because in whatever class I'm teaching, whether it's a literature class or a writing class, I expect the students to be doing research outside of class time. So whatever they're reading, I want them to be doing research into the terms or the words that they are unfamiliar to them. And I don't simply want them to go to Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is a great place to start, but it just gives you information. And I'm trying to train them through the research process that anybody can go to Wikipedia and get the information. Their job in doing research is to interpret the information they find and be able to state clearly why what they found is significant. So we practice that from the very first day. And they come to learn over the course of the semester what it means to say a finding is significant. The question about privacy is well, it's the subject.
Oh, Richard, if I may modify, because I can read them clearly now. So
Okay.
I apologize for that. So the first question had been, and you may have addressed this in the response you just gave, but I'll give you both of them so you could have them as context. Many students today don't necessarily view privacy as important in the same way as those of us who grew up before everyone lived with one foot in a digital world. How do you work with your students to help them understand why privacy even matters?
That's a great question, and I would say the book itself is my own effort to think through how the meaning of privacy has changed and what individuals' relationships to privacy is, be they young people or middle-aged people or old people. In a certain way, yes, young people are less concerned about privacy than older people are, just because of the way they use the pictures that they post online. But I think much of that is actually a result of naivete and a failure to think carefully about curating their online selves. Part of the tragedy of what happened between Tyler Clementi and Darwin Ravi is that Ravi, for all of his technical sophistication, he had his Twitter feed public. And that meant anybody could read his tweets. And in fact, as a young person, he thought, well, who would read my tweets? Who cares? But amazingly, it never occurred to him that one of the people who could be reading his tweets was his roommate. So he actually thought what he was doing when he was tweeting, he was doing it in private. He would have been shocked and stunned to know that his roommate was reading those tweets essentially in real time and then reading his friends' homophobic responses in real time. So partly we have to educate students to the fact that simply because um, they think no one's paying attention, they don't have to worry about privacy, versus the fact that whatever they post online can be resurrected at a later moment. And we have multiple examples of that in the last year. The prevalence of the cases in which prominent, successful politicians have been revealed to have had blackface pictures taken when they were in their teens is an example of, again, they didn't think they were doing that in private, but they certainly didn't expect it to be available for national and international publication. Um, Certainly the case for Trudeau in Canada. So we have to distinguish between a real naivete about publishing stuff that you assume nobody would be interested in, and a real deep understanding of the consequences of context changes and whether you care about what you published at that given moment. That information can be weaponized to control your access to employment, housing, fair legal counsel. So we can't bend on that. We have to serve as mentors and guides.
Thank you. And that's really insightful. So I have a second question for you. And
Okay.
sorry, again, I had combined them inadvertently before.
I thought they were two different
I know you were right. So,
questions.
and again, anyone that's listening, please, if any questions are coming up during this discussion or from the presentation, add them and we'll convey them to Richard. So do you cover research strategies with your students before asking them to do interpretive footnotes? And do you still ask them to use citation in traditional ways?
Well, I think I answered the first part of that question already, but the question about citation is something that I really enjoy teaching now. And this may upset some people, but I don't teach traditional paper-based citation anymore. What I do say, and actually, can they still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me go back a few spaces if I can figure out how to do that. And I can show you how that works. So here's the example of the one that I do in advance. So I'm modeling citing from the text. I'm modeling doing research that takes you to an unfamiliar source, discovering something new that you think other people would learn from and that you think is significant, acknowledging the limits of your own interpretation. And then at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that what I provide for students is a way to cite in your writing that doesn't distract from the experience of reading the writing itself. Um, and and actually, I'm grateful to the University of Pittsburgh because they allowed me to produce that book in a way that it wasn't completely marred by footnotes, because I've had hundreds of sources, and if I had a footnote for every single one, the experience of reading it would be very different. And so here, what I do is I provide a way to explain where the references come from in the writing, embed it in a link, in a link where the URL is hidden under a word, because I'm very committed to having the students produce writing that looks professional and where attention has been paid to detail. But then they can click on these and be taken to the source. And I say, this is my solution for how to cite responsibly and unobtrusively. But it's an invention. And I say, I'm open to other solutions you have. And so this way we have discussions about citation that aren't about, is the first letter supposed to be capitalized or not? And what it's really about is the intellectual issue of how do you help your reader get to uh, material that's extremely important, but do so in such a way that it doesn't get in the way of reading the writing that you've done that's the interpretive work.
Oh, wonderful. And I see one more question. And as I said, if any others come in while we're waiting, we'll ask that too. Given the efforts you make to get students to recognize the lack of privacy online, why do you choose to have them publish almost exclusively online? And how do you address their concerns about taking risks as writers in a public setting?
Uh, that's a fantastic question. uh, uh, I could entirely understand somebody who listened to the presentation and say, well, shouldn't you have people doing their papers on the writing they do on typewriters? uh, but what I want to do is train the students to learn how to write in the most powerful environment for writing that exists in the world, and that's online. And so the only way to learn how to do that is to do it. But I do it by creating my own website. I don't go through the university. And the writing that the students do in this online environment is completely protected. Um, uh, if you went to the website, you would be able to see my writing because I've chosen to make that public. But you wouldn't be able to see any of my students' writing. Um, it's not even password protected. You couldn't see it. You couldn't get to it. So their writing is online, but it's visible only to the other students in the class and only at the moment that the student writer chooses to make it visible to the other students. And so the class then is a semester-long exercise in practicing the act of consciously deciding when you're going to make something public. Um, and doing so in a safe space so that if you actually make a mistake or you publish something that's got something upsetting or could be cited out of context, it's all protected behind the wall of the website. It's still a safe-ish learning space. But I make it clear to them, all of that depends upon our respecting each other's privacy and nobody deciding to screen capture everything and print it. Um, so I have them do that because I want them to be able to know how to write using HTML and using WordPress. And this is a remarkable thing about working with young people. Sure, they they know how to navigate social media sites and they know how to find certain kinds of information with incredible skill. Uh, it's really about 1 out of 20 students that I find at the beginning of class who have ever been involved in doing this kind of work where you are putting pictures into your writing, you're searching the web, and you're producing writing that goes around that. That's different from doing a Facebook post where so much of this is automated and it's a drag and drop, and everything looks identical. Here, I want them to realize that part of the amazing aspect of the fact that writing now involves being a typesetter and an art designer, and then once you get published, your own publicist, um, is that I want them to see that there's a real aesthetic quality to the production. And yes, that involves the images that you choose and the quality of the images. But most importantly, of course, because it's a writing class and because I will remain somebody who is predominantly interested in language, I want them to pay attention to the aesthetic quality of their own writing. I want them to get to the point where they produce writing that isn't the kind of writing that exists, that gets read only by people who are paid to read it. They're teachers. And it's being on the web gives them an opportunity to say, like, hey, this is pretty good. I could publish this, and maybe it would be read by somebody who wasn't either paid to read it or is in my friend circle and reads stuff I write. And that helps them to, in concrete ways, to move towards the experience of being a writer.
Thank you. And of course, there's that multimodal aspect as well. So
Yeah.
that you're, as you say, preparing them for what we were saying, the type of writing they're going to do in their everyday lives in school. I'm going to go back to my screen a moment.
Okay.
And thank you so much for that. I think we already went through all the questions.
Okay.
And are you able to see my screen? I just want to confirm.
Oh, just a second.
Yes, okay.
Yes, I can see your screen. Yep.
I figured before I moved on.
Yep.
So I actually wanted to do a quick poll. I mentioned this at the start of the presentation. I'm going to launch. So the poll is open, and what I'm actually asking is, what is your greatest challenge in the writing classroom? And you'll notice on the dashboard, there'll be an area to the right. Okay, I'm seeing some responses come in. I'll give it another about 15 seconds to let everyone finish voting. But I could tell you right now, there's looking like a very unanimous winner here so far. But I don't want to skew whoever may still want to vote. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to close it. But what I'm seeing far and away as a winner is grading papers. So much time, so many comments. So that is obviously a pain point that is resonating with our professors. And you'll notice up on the screen, I brought up a program that we have that's a writing platform called Achieve. So let me just tell you a little bit about Achieve in the context of how it may be able to help in terms of the pain point that you just mentioned. So when it comes to Achieve, what we like to say about it is that we focus on engaging students in the writing process, helping them with things like revision, peer review, analytics. So the whole point of that program is to make stronger writers. And just to go quickly over the story, from the get-go, we've worked with students, with instructors, and you could see this in a format that we like to refer to as co-design, so that as we were building the program, we got real-time feedback from instructors that would be using it so that we could make the best writing tools platform possible that would address the concerns of students and instructors. And you could see some pictures of different instructors and students who have partnered with us. And speaking of partnering, just how we've been in composition since 1981, and we're strongly committed to the discipline. Now, I wanted to show you, because everyone was bringing up the grading of the papers. And this is just a section on reflection, which I'll go through quickly, but the drafting and commenting tool. So this is what I wanted to show you. When, as an instructor, if you were to use Achieve, what this allows you to do is make comments. And you'll see it's color-coded because it will actually point students to, let's say, something like what you can see over here where it says thesis. It will show students, you are having an issue with your thesis statement. Here's how we can help. And you could see that There's also differentiation among that color coding. Not only does it point students to the discrete skill they might need help with, it will tell them if it's something in terms of the level of revision they need to work on. If it's a nice job, needs work, needs extensive revision. With nice job, it's coded as green. So pretty much saying you've got a green light to go forward, you're on the right track with this particular assignment. If it's orange or yellow, it's saying slow down or stop, you need to rework this. And it helps students prioritize what they should have paid attention to in the paper first. And as we go through this area, you'll see that it also gives them all types of feedback and resources that they can refer to as they're writing their paper. So all the way to the right, you'll notice there's an ebook, and I'll say, since there was an issue with your thesis statement, here's a section on making a thesis statement substantive. So this very much focuses in on what it would look like for you as an instructor to grade your students' papers, make comments, and then the type of resources that students would have available to them. And if you have all your students submit their paper through Achieve, through this writing platform, you have all this information in one neat package in one location. And what's also helpful here, you could see the instructor feedback links to the resources, as I mentioned earlier, and the ebook is available for the students. And this task, I always like to mention, this actually came as a result of what I was mentioning earlier in our partnership with instructors. We did not have a revision task built into papers. And because we heard from instructors that they felt that was crucial, that if you're going to give students all this feedback, it'd be important for them to lay out what a revision plan should look like. We actually built that into the program based on instructor feedback. And what the revision plan does, as you can see here, is it asks students to say something like, okay, I got this comment on my thesis statement saying the thesis does not present a critical response. What am I going to do based on that comment? And the student will type in, I'm going to narrow my thesis. The student could also say, I'm going to attend office hours. I'm going to go to the writing center. And what's wonderful about this, it makes them accountable right on the spot for what are they going to do to address this particular writing problem. And you as the instructor would be able to go in and see what that student's revision plan looks like for all the comments on the paper. And that's where you can see that clearly here. And you can see how the student mentioned the writing center, narrowing the thesis statement, or saying things like going to office hours. So I just wanted to make everyone just provide an overview of this is one of the tools in our new writing platform that helps address how to, let's say, consolidate all these comments and make it easier for you as an instructor and for your student to see that feedback, to respond to it, and to formulate an action plan. If anyone would be interested, we can offer an Achieve demo and provide more detail, but for the purposes of today's webinar, I just wanted to give you an overview because we hear all too often from instructors how much of a pain point grading papers can be. Okay.
That was really interesting, Vivian. It made me think of one addition to the second edition that.
Oh yes, please.
I'm happy to say that Macmillan has now produced a teacher's edition of Habits that has the instructor's manual printed in the book itself. And so that includes essays by us about how to teach the book, including essays about how to handle the grading load and how to grade papers that are produced by people who are trying to think creatively. So it's a resource that I think is a very important addition to the book.
Excellent. And I wanted to leave this screen up for a moment. You could see that I've provided both an email address for Richard as well as an email address for me. And I invite you, if you're interested in getting a desk copy of Habits of the Creative Mind, or if you wanted more information about our writing platform Achieve, I would be more than happy to arrange that for you. And I wanted to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart for joining us this afternoon for the last of our webinar series this week. And if you're interested in knowing what the topics were for the others, you could also reach out to me and I would be happy to send you the links to the recordings and the slides for those. And Richard, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say, but I'm so grateful to everybody who participated today.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody who came, and the questions were really spot on. So I enjoyed it, and I really would be happy to be in touch with anybody who wants to talk about the ideas or the book or just about teaching in the digital environment.
Wonderful. So as a follow-up, just a reminder, we will be sending you the slides for this presentation as well as a link to the recording. And again, can't invite you enough to contact us. And as a final, thank you for everyone for attending. Have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, take care.